In this roundup of the week, CO2 emissions flatlined in 2019, but is that really the start of a trend? A judge in the UK provides a landmark ruling in favour of free speech, and BP becomes the first major oil company to commit to net zero carbon. My name is Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show for change makers. It's Valentine's Day. And what more romantic way to spend the evening than having a lovely meal together with the love of your life, pouring a big glass of wine afterwards and settling down to watch this video about what's happening in the world that's worth knowing. Alright, I'm kidding. I would be seriously worried if you actually did that. YouTube's amazing, the video will still be here tomorrow. So, we saw headlines this week and they were exciting headlines indeed. CO2 emissions have flatlined. Which doesn't mean that much, it just means that we emitted exactly the same as much last year as we did the year before, 33 gigatons. But that's obviously different to increasing emissions. And the reason why it's significant is that during the same time period, the world economy expanded by 2.9%. So these weren't flatlined emissions purely because the economy was flatlined. It's a real indicator that more emissions are being reduced from economic activity than are being added to it. The decline of coal has been part of this story. According to the International Energy Agency, coal-based emissions declined by almost 200 million tonnes from 2018 levels. That offset a growth in emissions from oil and natural gas. The advanced economies saw their emissions decline by 3.2%, with the power sector responsible for a majority, around 85%. But these things are never independent of the context. In 2019, there were milder temperatures in many locations, so that means there's a knock-on effect in the amount of energy used in heating. The milder weather is thought to account for about a drop of 150 megatons. Nevertheless, the trend in emerging economies such as India was up, simply sharpening the dilemma to be faced in the COP26 conference on climate change when it takes place towards the end of this year. According to the IEA, the data suggests that an energy transition is definitely underway in a number of countries led by the power sector, with decreases coming from the European Union, the United States and Japan, and increases in the rest of the world. The US declines have largely come from the gradual shift from coal to natural gas. The decline from the European Union, and for these figures that includes the UK, although presumably not next year, saw emissions down by 160 megatons or 5%. And that comes from a shift from coal to gas and to renewables. Germany and the UK led the decline. In Japan, the decline has come from its nuclear power generation coming back online after Fukushima, enabling a switch away from coal. Does this mean that we've reached a definitive peak in emissions and we can now look forward to a steady decline beginning to take shape? I'm going to go out on a limb and say, nah, not yet. Don't get me wrong, it may absolutely mean that. I just don't think it'll be that easy or that straightforward. For one thing, this isn't the first time. 2014 and 2015 were also flat. Secondly, I don't think the activity we see happening around the world yet adds up to a ongoing emerging decline in emissions. Not yet. With the coal power station building happening in certain major countries, such as China and India, I wouldn't want to bet that we'd seen the final end of coal expansion. In the US, it's not clear how much continued progress there'll be once the effect of this one-time change from coal to natural gas has been completed. A number of the states are independently looking to reduce emissions, so maybe progress will continue. It's not entirely obvious how it all plays out just yet, not least because of the current election process. Japan, which was thoroughly spooked by Fukushima, has plans to build up to 22 new coal-fired power stations, so the decline in emissions there seems to be likely to go into reverse. So there's a lot more water to pass under the bridge, I think, before we get to the downward slope. Strangely, the BBC didn't cover this story on its website, or at least not when I looked for it. It did cover a story in December that the Global Carbon Project had predicted that emissions would have risen by 0.6% in 2019. You'd think it would want to update people on the story, but apparently not. I know some people will be quick to jump up and down and say, see, the BBC only ever reports one type of news on the issue. I'm sure they would say that wasn't the case, although a look at their current stories doesn't entirely contradict it. Incidentally, one place where it was covered was the climate skeptic blog What's Up With That, which led with the headline, "Bad News for Climate Alarmists, Global Carbon Dioxide Emissions Flatlined in 2019. I rolled my eyes at that with the initial thought that it was typical of the tribalistic nonsense in this debate that assumed that the other side are into a mindset where they're actually pleased when there's bad news because it fits the narrative and displeased when there's actually good news. I rolled my eyes, but then I did think back to some of the abuse that I've had on here from Extinction Rebellion types when I presented a nuanced picture by talking about some of the positive messages from the science and the scientists. So maybe it's an unhelpful generalisation that the bulk of good people wouldn't fit into, but generalisations only work because there are those archetypes out there. Anyway, those that are in that negative frame of mind were proving the point by focusing on another data area altogether, focusing on the warmer temperatures in the Antarctic. Specifically, the headline that the Antarctic had hit 20 degrees centigrade for the first time. You could tell this was important because I had several commentators coming onto my channel to point it out. It was 70F in Ant Bleep Arctica the other day, and similar sober reflections. The headlines came from the fact that there was one reading on an island off the coast of Antarctica, Seymour Island, that got to 20.75 degrees centigrade, which is a record high since measurements began at that location. In the BBC story on this, they prominently featured the Brazilian scientist Carlos Schaeffer, who, whilst noting that he'd never seen a temperature this high, nevertheless added the caution that we would associate with genuine scientists, because that's what they tend to do. Specifically, he pointed out this was one temperature reading in one location. It wasn't part of a long-term data set, so it couldn't be used to predict any kind of trend. We can't use this to anticipate climatic changes in the future. It's a data point. It's simply a signal that something different is happening in that area. And that, of course, is right. There's clearly a period of significant warmth in Antarctica right now. Rather than reacting the first time somebody reports a single data reading and racing around flapping your arms about, it pays to notice the fact and wait for more time and more accumulated data before jumping to conclusions about what it means about where we are. I already know as I say that there'll be a whole heap of trouble coming my way in the comment section from people saying things like, "Mallen's denying the Antarctic's warming." And no, I'm not. I'm saying that running around in a hissy fit when the BBC jumps on a single data point and treats it as the latest evidence that the apocalypse is upon us is no way proportionate, nor is it helping. The previous higher data point in that location was 19 degrees C. Just because a number has a 0 at the end doesn't make it a suddenly big deal. Here's the temperature anomaly map for the station that recorded for 20 degrees centigrade. There are a number of significant variances, so having one variance that nudges a little bit higher doesn't turn it into an end of the world story, which is why the scientist quoted slightly downplayed it. It's not that there isn't a wider context, and we know the context. According to the World Meteorological Office, temperatures in Antarctica have risen by 3 degrees centigrade over the last 50 years. It's just that we need to be savvy to the propensity of headline writers to grab onto relatively minor elements such as this and turn them into big hissy fit moments. That's how you turn situations that are serious and need concerted action into ones that give children the mistaken belief that their world is doomed and they won't live to grow old. Speaking of factually inaccurate claims, let's move on to the idea that discussing sex and gender somehow automatically qualifies as hate speech. Today there was a landmark ruling in a UK court case that was brought by a man who was cautioned by police for tweeting a limerick. Harry Miller, an ex-policeman, was visited by police in Humberside in the north of England after a complaint about his tweets. He'd done things like questioning whether transgender women were real women, and he'd retweeted some lyrics from a feminist song which the police described as a limerick. Vicious, brutal stuff, as you can tell. The police warned him about his behaviour and said that even though he hadn't committed a crime, he needed to check his thinking. And it was recorded as a non-crime hate incident. For many people, this raised alarm bells and visions of Orwell's 1984, and he took the police to court for overreaching their powers. Well, the judge, Mr. Justice Julian Knowles, let the police have it with both barrels. I find the combination of police visiting the claimant's place of work and their subsequent statements in relation to the possibility of prosecution were a disproportionate interference with the claimant's right to freedom of expression because of their potential chilling effect. The judge said that the impact of the police shouldn't be underestimated. To do so would be to undervalue a cardinal democratic freedom. In this country, we have never had a Cheka, a Gestapo or a Stasi. We have never lived under an Orwellian society. I conclude that the police's actions led him to reasonably believe he was being warned not to exercise his right to freedom of expression about transgender issues on pain of potential criminal prosecution. Harry Miller's solicitor said the judge had given a strong warning to local police forces not to interfere with people's free speech rights on matters of significant controversy. He added, today the judge held that it's entirely acceptable to hold the view and communicate that a trans woman is not a woman. That view is not hateful, transphobic or unlawful. It's not entirely obvious that the final point was accepted by Humberside Police. Having said that it accepted the ruling, it went on to say, the mere recording of the incident by Humberside Police as a hate incident has been ruled as not unlawful and in accordance with the College of Police guidance. So they're thinking that you shouldn't tell somebody off or tell them that they shouldn't carry on, but in any case, you'll still record it as a hate incident. Now that seems somewhat unsatisfactory. Where are the checks and balances in that judgment? What are the implications? And you'll note the police accepted the ruling, but they're clearly not minded to accept the wider points. They fought the case. They still want to mark it down as a hate incident if you have a certain opinion on a contentious issue. Harry Miller agrees that this isn't over, and his legal team will be appealing the finding that the guidance itself is lawful. So more to come on this. It's worth noting as well, whereas the other cases I've mentioned here in the past, such as the one with Maya Forstater, have been employment tribunals, this one was the High Court. So much more the appropriate level for these issues to be resolved, much more solid as a legal precedent. The news came as another case, sort of related but not quite as straightforward, went the other way entirely. Kate Scottow was prosecuted for malicious communications following a string of trolling tweets aimed at a transgender campaigner, Stephanie Hayden. One of the things she apparently did was to refer to her as a he, which has now become a big deal because it counts as misgendering. Indeed, you can be barred from Twitter for doing such a thing, although enforcement seems to be somewhat inconsistent on that score. But I say that it's not quite as straightforward because it seems that she also sent a lot more abusive messages, calling her target a racist and a pig in a wig and all sorts of things. Allegedly, she created multiple Twitter accounts to be able to continue sending harassing messages and tweets. I haven't reviewed the Twitter storm. I do think in principle there has to be a point where if someone is just solidly abusing someone, then there should be some sort of recourse. But, I tend to think it should be at the appropriate level. If someone becomes so tedious on Twitter, they do have a mechanism to block them. And it only takes seconds to block someone and longer than that, quite a bit longer than that to set up a new account. So sooner or later, you're going to outlast them. And if they break the Twitter terms of use, which should surely happen before you cross the line into illegality, then Twitter should be able to just ban them from the platform. So even if Mrs. Scottow crossed the line well beyond what I would think personally was good behaviour, it seems to me this shouldn't probably have ended up in court. Given how quick some activists are, and I don't know anything about the person in this case, how quick they are to try and use the law to bludgeon their opponents into silence. And the fact that misgendering was specifically mentioned in court as one of the actionable offences, I don't find that very encouraging. And that stands in contrast to the other case. So how all this gets settled out, who knows? It seems to me we're not out of the woods yet on the whole story of what is or is not free speech and what protection you actually have for it. Don't get me wrong, I think if you abuse someone on Twitter or anywhere else, you're a bit of a garbage person. But free speech is free speech because it protects speech we don't approve of. That's the whole point. And the principle is being tested in multiple places at once. For instance, Rebecca Long-Bailey, one of the candidates for the leadership of the Labour Party and seen by some as the natural successor to the spirit of Jeremy Corbyn, has said that Labour should expel members who express transphobic views. She signed up to a declaration that says women should be defined as a gender rather than as a sex. So what gets counted as a transphobic view could be anyone who disagrees with that as a starting proposition. She says she supports self-identification, which means that if I say right now that I'm a woman, then I am. And if you say that I'm not, then you can be expelled from the Labour Party. So that seems an approach well calculated to win back the support of the working class voters who shifted to Boris Johnson in the last election. And talking of people self-declaring as unlikely things, this week we had oil major BP announcing that it was signing up to the target of being carbon neutral by 2050. This is one of those announcements that had to happen, but manages to enrage absolutely everybody on all sides of the debate, which is always kind of fun to watch. You know, you get one life, you might as well enjoy the show. This comes from BP's new chief executive, the unfortunately named Bernard Looney, although I'm sure nobody will be mean enough to play on that. He said that the company would eliminate its carbon footprint not just from its operations, but also from the oil and gas that it provides. He took over from former boss Bob Dudley last week, and he said that he'd reached the inescapable conclusion that BP had to change, and said that the need for cleaner energy represented not an existential threat to the company, but a huge opportunity. BP pumped 2.7 million barrels of oil and gas per day last year. That doesn't change overnight, and nor should it, given that the alternative infrastructure doesn't exist and won't for some time. But he said that it would produce less over time and increase investment in green energy such as renewables. As part of doing this, the company will end the organisational split the company's used for more than a century of upstream business and downstream business. The big challenge, as far as I can see, lies in the target to decarbonise any residual oil and gas that it continues to produce. The assumption is that by 2050 there'll be a lot less of this, then maybe it simply becomes an offsetting equation or a carbon capture equation. Some of the companies developing the technology to capture carbon from the atmosphere have had investment from oil companies. And that kind of makes sense as an overall strategy to head in that direction and to profit from the technology of the future that needs significant energy resources to push it to scale. But it's an open question of the moment what this will look like going down the line. The campaigners will complain that it hasn't happened already, and every sign they see of the status quo they'll claim is evidence that it's all just empty words. And I certainly don't imagine that they'll stop trying to persuade organisations to avoid taking sponsorship from BP, which is okay, because in spite of what they might tell themselves, BP isn't doing this because of Extinction Rebellion. They've had campaigners attacking them for many decades, and they have a pretty thick skin when it comes to all of that. The perspective of investors may well be part of it, and BlackRock, which announced a more activist mindset on climate change a little while ago, is one of BP's investors. Interestingly, BP's been down this path before. When he was chief executive at the turn of the century, John Brown, now Lord Brown, announced that the company was moving towards BP standing for Beyond Petroleum, and it started to invest in certain solar and other renewable businesses, although it's fair to say it was only a start. What people don't much know is what happened then, which is that a lot of the powerful leaders within BP, who were engineers, only slowly woke up to the real scale of what Brown and his supporters had just announced. And when they did realise, they fought back hard. And how it would have played out, who knows? Because we never got to find out, because Brown ended up impaled on a completely unrelated scandal to do with him covering up his sexuality. He resigned as chief executive, and his replacement, Tony Hayward, very much of the engineer mindset, steered BP away from that radical course that Brown had been mapping out. And of course came to grief in his own way when the BP deepwater oil explosion happened in the Gulf of Mexico. Ironically, because of health and safety failings that dated back to the Brown era. So BP has faced this challenge before. Doesn't mean anything. It's a different time. The agenda's more advanced. Governments are now adopting net zero carbon by 2050 programs. So how the oil industry begins to respond and adapt to manage what must now surely become a declining industry will be interesting to see. You can still make a good profit from managing decline, and no society is going to be in a position to turn off the oil tap anytime soon, but an orderly transition that protects economy and people as well as the environment will partly depend on companies like BP stepping up to be part of the active management of a transition. We don't know what that looks like. They don't know what that looks like. So we've got some work to do. We don't have time this week to talk about the UK government reshuffle with a new Environment Secretary, George Eustice, who seems like he might be a good guy, although needless to say the campaigners hate him already. And the new chair for the COP26 conference has also been announced via that reshuffle, Alok Sharma, the new business secretary. And we don't have time to talk about the toings and goings and froings of the Democratic primaries in the US, with the radical Bernie Sanders rising to the top of the pack, but with moderate challengers still in play and with Michael Bloomberg hovering in the wings. We just have times for a couple of things that I like and a couple of things that I don't. Although actually, now that I think about it, no, it's mostly things that I don't like. There are academic papers and there are academic papers. I hold the research in the physical sciences in mostly high regard. I have a slightly different view about the so-called social sciences. And here we have the bastard child of the two, and it's ugly. This paper, which I'm going to go all the way and called a pseudo-scientific paper, was released this week. A well-known climate scientist, I'm not going to name names, retweeted something celebrating it. This is the cause of my despair. Power, Evil and Resistance in Social Structure, a sociology for energy research in a climate emergency. Now, I understand why campaigners believe that climate emergency is a good campaign language for them. I personally disagree, but I definitely don't think it belongs in an academic paper. The highlights. The climate emergency demands a radical rethink of sociology for energy research. Powerful, self-serving actors construct and maintain climate-damaging social structure. Moral argument will not persuade such actors to surrender their power. The notion of evil is useful for theorizing how their power can be dislodged. Pseudo-academia trying to make stupid us versus them approaches to complex mutual problems into something that has intellectual respectability. The fact that there are some wackos out there prepared to write such a paper is not hugely surprising. The fact that an actual scientist felt that it's worth sharing is kind of deeply worrying. And no, it doesn't mean that all scientists are alarmists or any of that nonsense, but it obviously feeds that particular beast in an unhelpful way. The second thing I don't like, a Cambridge professor is releasing a new book called The A-Human Manifesto. The premise of the book is pretty straightforward and obviously uncontroversial. It's that human beings should be allowed to go extinct for the sake of the planet. Here is the professor concerned, one Patricia McCormack, a professor of continental philosophy, which is a thing apparently. According to the report, the book argues that due to the damage done to other living creatures on Earth, we should start gradually phasing out reproduction. But rather than offering a bleak look at the future of humanity, it has generated discussion due to its joyful and optimistic tone, as it sets out a positive view for the future of Earth without mankind. On the one hand, it's a colossal waste of time, someone looking for attention by putting something out intended to shock, and here we are giving her that attention for about 2 minutes. But on the other, it's just incredibly unhelpful. It's hard enough to have a rational discussion in this space as it is, with one side saying the UN Agenda 21 conspiracy is trying to impose population control, and the other side telling children human extinction is on the cards. Here's the thing. I read a book about the natural history of dinosaurs the other day, and the astonishing ability of life to regenerate over the time span of millions of years is in no doubt whatsoever. However badly we screw this up, if we send the whole thing skywards in a massive nuclear war, followed by a century of nuclear winter and an irradiated landscape for thousands of years, guess what? Some species at some level will survive, even if it's only at microbial level, and that means that within a million years or two, life will be back in all its varied forms. Wouldn't it be fascinating to know what form that would take? Well, we'll never know. It's our turn. There's nothing predetermined about us bowing out anytime soon. The fact that if we do, then things will recover eventually maybe is some comfort, until the sun goes supernova and fries everything that's here anyway. We're all just passing through. It's amazing and magical that we're here at all. Enjoy the ride. You might as well. Anyway, that's enough of that. My name's Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show.